Welcome to Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you here to this series. And today we're talking about exploring Asian identities in Canada beyond conflation and exceptionalism. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. First, I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Yonwanda, the Seneca, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. I want to thank the junior fellows who brought up the idea of doing a special dialogue on Asian identities because May is the month of Asian heritage. So I am delighted that we are putting this series together, and I want to thank them for organizing this event. And without further ado, I'm passing it to our previous Dawn of Hall, Christine Tran.
Thank you, Nathalie. Hello, all. I'm Christine Tran. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. As Nathalie said, I was last year's Dawn of Hall, and my ongoing doctoral research looks at the interplay of race, gender, and domestic space in the careers of video game live streamers. Now combined, Massey and research, these experiences make me think a lot about the roles that technologies play in bringing us together. And as the global pandemic has many of us revisiting what it means to be together can be a difficult question. As I paraphrase from our lovely President Spirit junior fellow collaborator Dongwoo Kim, COVID has seen a shocking but unsurprising rise in the number of hate crimes and attacks on the Asian diaspora communities across Canada and the United States, serving as a catalyst for individual and collective reckonings of Asian Canadians with their complex identities. An assemblage of uncomfortable feelings aptly described by Cathy Park Hong as minor feelings, and within this text too. As it often happens with a lot of things involving both the States and Canada, the discussion of Canadian identities has largely moved to either the conflation of Asian identities in Canada and the US, or even more unfortunately, overbroad comparisons between Canada and the States, where Canadians inevitably might celebrate their success with multiculturalism on the very compelling ground that Canada is doing better. As both personal stories and social science data suggest, this is simply not true. There has always been histories of violence and exclusions against Asians in Canada, which remains and forms both literal and discursive to this day, certainly made more visible through the pandemic, but in no way new. In this context, our dialogue centers the conversation on the Asian's identity in Canada, in which we here will tackle overbroad generalizations of the Canadian experience itself. And in the spirit of refusing essentialization, we come to you asynchronously together in a dialogue in the truest sense among these incredible speakers from our community. So allow me to present first Lily Cho. Lily Cho is a senior fellow and a former Massey York fellow, an associate dean for global and community engagement at York University, and a professor of English. Her new book, Mass Capture: Chinese Head Tax and the Making of Non-Citizens, looks at the relationship between race and citizenship. She is really very proud that this is the first open access book published by McGill Queen's University Press. Much of this book was written during her year as a senior resident fellow in House 5 at Massey College, and she will be forever grateful to Massey for the tremendous intellectual companionship that helped her make her book possible. It's lovely to have you, Lily.
Thank you so much, Christine.
And Dr. Sunit Das. Dr. Sunit Das studied literature and philosophy at the University of Michigan and Harvard University before graduating from Northwestern University Medical School in Chicago, Illinois in 2001. He then pursued a PhD at the National Institutes of Health, Ireland, during which time he studied the biology of neural stem cells. He centered the neurosurgical training program at Northwestern University in 2003. In 2010, he joined the faculty in the Division of Neurosurgery at St. Michael's Hospital and the University of Toronto. His clinical interest is in the surgical management of malignant brain tumors and tumors involving the skull base. His laboratory investigates the biology of stem cells in the normal brain and in primary brain tumors, and we're delighted to also have him here.
Thanks so much, Christine.
And last but certainly not least, allow me to introduce my co-moderator and fellow junior fellow, Stacy Chen. Stacy Chen is a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy and the Joint Center for Bioethics. She grew up in Singapore before moving to Toronto for undergrad and found herself interested in differences in systems of ethics and politics across cultural contexts, which informed her studies in international relations and bioethics. Her proposed doctoral research focuses on issues of paternalism and physician duty and the incorporation of culturally pluralistic frameworks in medical ethics. And I'm really delighted to have worked with Stacy and the president spirit Dongwoo Kim in developing this really integral dialogue. It really could not have been possible without this the collaboration of these great minds I have here today. And I'm happy to be here with Stacy.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christine, for that intro, and thank you all for participating in this dialogue. It's certainly an important and timely conversation to be had. I suppose to begin, maybe to frame our subsequent, more specific discussions, it would be great to have each of us maybe briefly describe what brings us to this table, so to speak. So I suppose I could start with a few brief thoughts. So personally, when asked, I tend to resort to, in terms of my relationship with my Asian American identity or Asian Canadian identity, when asked, I tend to resort to characterizing myself as a third culture kid. I was born and raised in Singapore, albeit educated at a string of international schools, each with Australian, Canadian, and British influences, respectively, with parents who were born and raised in China but immigrated to Canada. So this makes me neither a first-generation immigrant to Canada, nor does it make me feel truly Canadian, despite what it says on my passport. As a result, I find myself identifying with bits and pieces of the Chinese, Singaporean, British, and Canadian cultural idiosyncrasies that I've picked up over the years. I nonetheless feel a strong longing to remain true to my roots, that is, my quote-unquote Asian culture. Whether that is the ability to speak the language, uphold the traditions, adopt the aesthetics, or respect the values of, in my case, Chinese culture. And often I will fiercely defend any and all of these aspects of my background when I feel that they are being criticized. Yet I realize that I am, in a sense, one step removed from my heritage. I've picked up these traditions and values via osmosis from my parents. I was not truly immersed within them in the way that they were, and I fear that they will be further washed away as I spend more time away from the homeland, so to speak. So I pose the question to you all. What brings you to this dialogue? How do you identify or not with your Asian identity? What reflections do you have on how your identity as an Asian American, however you choose to define it, has or has not shaped where you are now? Perhaps we could start with Dr. Cho, then Dr. Das, and then Christine. Dr. Cho.
Thank you, Stacy. And it's just a delight to be here, a great thrill and an honor to be on this in this dialogue with amazing minds. I'm here in quite an immediate sense, following up on a discussion on Cathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, which Christine gestured towards in her introduction. We discussed this book as part of the Massey book club, and I was very honored to be invited to be one of the presenters and discussants around this book. And one of the things that came up out of that discussion was a sense of urgency, I think, and need to talk more about the conversation we had in the book club itself, the role of Asian identities and Asian Canadian identities within Massey, within Toronto, and then in Canada, and sort of scoping out from there. Personally, I think that my experience of being Asian diasporic, Asian Canadian, Chinese Canadian, through the higher education sector in Canada has been one of constant reflection. And I think that part of what I'm so looking forward to in this dialogue is engaging with all of you on the complexities of that. I'm looking forward to talking to Dr. Das about his experience of being in literature and then moving, out of that field into quite a different field. My own experience, having been a graduate student in literature in the 90s, late 90s in Canada, was that there were almost no Asian Canadian texts that we could talk about. They were not on any of my reading lists, and there were very, very few people who I could turn to. And one of the things that I find so enlivening about this room now, this virtual room that we're in, is the way in which junior fellows at Massey have demanded this conversation, and the way in which junior fellows such as Stacy and Christine and Dongwu have identified the importance of bringing this conversation to Massey and to the ways in which we differentiate US and Canadian experiences, but also identifying their connections. So that's part of the diasporic element that I'm particularly interested in. And I look forward to further conversation about this, but I'll throw it back to you, Stacy, or to Dr. Das right now. And I look forward to talking more about all of these threads.
Great, thank you, Lily. Perfect segue to Dr. Das, I suppose. Maybe you could speak about the US-Canadian sort of the difference between your experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. Lily, I'll say so much of what you said resonated as you were speaking, and I'll go back to a word that you used, that Christine also used as well, just complexity. And it's interesting. You think about our communities as diasporic communities, and these identities that resonated and made sense within a certain place, and didn't lose their critical meaning, but certainly changed in valence when they were brought here. And I think about this constant dissonance between self-realization and authenticity that I've felt very much a narrative in my own life, and so much around my ethnicity and my cultural heritage. And I'll say I'm the child of Bangladeshi and Kenyan parents. My parents immigrated to the U.S. when I was a young child, and I grew up first in New York and then in Detroit, and then in a suburb of Detroit. And I think, Lily, speaking to what your experience was in graduate school, I mean, certainly, I think I grew up in a time where America had no idea what to do with an Indian, let alone an African Indian. And I found myself finding pockets where I could fit and where I could find resonance with elements that made sense to who I was. And it's interesting. I'll speak to something Don Wu said that really resonated with me when we met a few weeks ago. One of the hardest elements of being an immigrant is that you find yourself not quite fitting here, but then also being told by family back home that you're no longer authentically one of them. And I certainly felt that as a constant growing up and negotiating what that meant as I moved into adulthood. Certainly for me, I've learned so much from trying to have that dialogue. And my hope is that I can move further along with that by hearing what your experiences have been as well.
Great, thank you, Dr. Das. Christine?
Thanks, Stacy, and thank you so much, Dr. Cho and Dr. Das, for leveling the bringing up the playing field. I have to step up to here with your responses. I come to this as a member, like you all, like a member of this community at Massey College, and having served as Dawn for 1 year in continually challenging times where it came up a lot that in the history of this college, I was the first racialized woman presenting Dawn in the 60-year history of Massey. 6 decades of faces that did not look like me before me taking on duties in really different spatial as well as temporal frameworks of what it meant to take on this mantle of academic leadership And that helps that, like, my experience with donship within Massey kind of like relates to how I arrive at the broader question of what like Asian identity means to me as like the daughter of Vietnamese refugees who came here in the early 90s and lived several years learning how to become quote unquote Canadian citizens before I rolled into their lives, and lived several decades before then learning how to grapple with transitioning out of a country to and sacrificing so much to build a life here atop a problematic atop settled a land that has already been violently pre-settled. And so I think I arrived to Asian identity as a series of narratives about spatial coordination, and rather I think about it in relationship to time. I think this temporal element of what it means to be Asian American in Asian Canadian is something I want to sit on too. Like I'm so really piqued by the keywords that are have been brought up by Dr. Cho and Dr. Das. Like Dr. Chen used the word that this conversation can be very enlivening. And as somebody who studies racialized and gendered people, and game players, and live streaming, I think a lot about time and who is afforded the technological resources to be present and in which communities. And growing up, you've heard the story first gen kid of to go to university in an Asian family, growing up and figuring out how to navigate Canadian institutions without those temporal resources of having a family that has navigated these same universities before me. I often think about like I'm trying to personally move away in my own experience from carving a sense of my own Asian Canadianness that has to be defined in so much lack. Is there an ability? Is there how do we as Asian hyphen Canadians structure an identity for ourselves that isn't so in relation in deficit, doesn't begin in that temporal deficit? And at the same time, how do we navigate if thinking about identity as also a temporal historical relation to the stories and traumas of parents and grandparents that I might never begin to access? How do we begin to navigate a future if we as like a country haven't settled with the baggage of the past and present? Because sometimes being precarious like academic worker in these spaces without that like genealogy of support behind you in this country can feel like you're racing towards a precarious future that isn't exactly made for you. And I know that experience, even within Massey College, among other racialized students, is not so unique and special to me. And so I like this idea of this identity as being something we like arrive to, and whatever we're aspiring to achieve and build together has to be, I think, considered as a historical material relation. When thinking about these questions, I had a more flippant response about like what brings me to this dialogue. Maybe like the same supply chain that as your internet connection. But then I wanted to sit with that more because as a game scholar, I work a lot with people who study the global supply chains that bring us our like games, our leisure objects, our leisure spaces, and we take for granted about how much our identity here, my own ability to kick back with a game here, to kick back in digital leisure spaces with you, despite this being a global pandemic that keeps us physically like apart, how much of that is contingent on orientalized supply chains. Like these moments of time we have to enliven ourselves and figure out our own authenticity are the result of supply chains of labor extracted from Asia and the global south. And what does arriving to ourselves as not just a series of keywords and hashtags, but also historical material relations. Like, what does it mean to be able to come to all this history behind you and create whatever time frame we want to develop for ourselves after?
Great. Thank you, Christine. So very interesting about that sort of idea of connecting ourselves back to our roots and sort of the progression, like the things that we owe to all the people who came before, I think is very sort of significant in Asian American history. And sort of, I guess, tying together the threads that we've sort of been discussing so far, the issue of sort of home, what is home? How do we reconcile being from Asia but living in the West? And I think I also like the sort of thread of literature that Lily brought up. And upon sort of thinking through these two ideas, what comes to mind for me is the way in which literature and the arts sort of can help us reconcile what home means to us. What comes to mind for me is Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights. There's one line in that musical, which is primarily about Latin American immigrants. But this particular line by this character, who she goes off to college, and her name's Nina. And her story within the musical is that she goes off to Stanford to try and learn more about herself by sort of through an academic means, or through an academic lens, but is seemingly unable to sort of top down realize what it is to be an immigrant. You can't sort of, she comes to the conclusion that you can't sort of learn what it is about your subjective experience that makes it special by sort of looking through an objective lens. So reading theory, etc., won't really educate yourself about what it is to be an immigrant in a subjective, in an emotional way. And the line that she says is, who would I be if I'd never seen Manhattan, if I lived in Puerto Rico with my people? And I think about that a lot. Who would I be if my parents had not immigrated to Canada? What would I be like if I lived, quote unquote, with my people? I suppose for me, it's slightly different. I grew up in Singapore, which is, granted, has a significant Chinese community, as opposed to if I'd grown up here. And so I guess a question that I would like to pose to everyone is, what do you think it means to be Asian in Canada or in the States? How do you conceptualize your relationship with Canadian or American culture in contrast to, or sort of in harmony with, that of your homeland? How would you define being Canadian or American? And do you feel Canadian or American? Perhaps we could start with Lily.
Thank you, Stacy. Those are such rich questions. They're such good questions. And I want to respond to them partly by picking up on something that Christine brought up. And that is the ways in which class is also part of this discussion. I am also the first person in my family to attend university. I grew up in Edmonton. It was an incredibly lonely place in so many ways. My father came out to Canada in the aftermath of many years in gulags. My mother only had a fourth grade education. It was just a very specific experience, but also as I have moved through the world, I recognize much that's collective and shared in that experience. And Christina, to get back to Stacy's question about how I understand Chineseness or my Asianness in relation to ideas of Canada or America, I really think about a form of perpetual grief and mourning, and it's tied into my journey into higher education. I think that my parents had very incredible hopes that my brother and I would pursue higher education, like so many Asian immigrant families. And yet, part of what was bound up in that hope was a recognition I think they always had, and which I had to come to, that every step I took into higher education was a step away from them. And that was both something I did for them, for myself, but also something that meant that I would be farther and farther away from them. Not just physically, and that I am physically far from them, partly because of the work I do, but also psychically, culturally, and socially. This perpetual grief, I think, is also part of the ways in which I think about Asianness or Chineseness in Canada for so many people in our communities. And it was brought to me to bear in very specific ways in the past 2 years when we have seen the spike in anti-Asian violence in the US and Canada. And, the recorded events of that violence doesn't even begin to touch the reality of it. We know that instances of anti-Asian violence are massively underreported. Every time I read a police report, I I grieve because I know that my parents would never have reported those things. The things that have been, I just know that people in my family would would have borne it. And I think about all the people in Canada and the US who have been subjected to these forms of harassment and violence, who have simply borne this pain and this grief. So I don't so I don't mean to be such a downer, but I think that one of the ways in which, we come back to some of the things that Christine said about settling, how we settle the baggage of the place where we are now and the places where we need to go. Part of it is to actually, I think, engage with a very real process of grieving. And and I know that, coming out of, or not coming out, but in the historical moment where we are, we're more aware of loss, I think, than we have been as communities in general. But I think that attending to those losses in ways that are not just vertical, through within a family or through generations, but also horizontal across communities, is really so profoundly important. And I'll say one more thing for throwing it back to you, Stacy, and that is, when I remember talking with Dongwu and Christine, and one of the things we talked about was how, we're coming up to the 1 year anniversary of the Atlanta killings of Korean and Korean American women in the US, and how difficult it was then and now to explain to our white Canadian colleagues and fellow travelers in the worlds that we inhabit why those killings mattered to us. Why it was so important for someone like me to mark those deaths, and why they hit me the way they did. I'm not Korean. I don't live in Atlanta, but that event, you know, was a signal event in so many ways, coming out of a long history of gendered anti-Asian violence in particular. And so this brings me back then to the importance of the kind of generational discussion that Christine and Stacy have also brought to the fore, and to sort of close my little bit here with on a more positive note. I am profoundly filled with profound joy. I have to tell you that it was junior fellows who brought this discussion to the table. We're here in this dialogue now because junior fellows said, we need to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation in the context of a kind of canonical Massey event, and that makes me I feel so great, because the junior fellows have always led the way at Massey, and it matters to me that junior fellows are leading the way in this particular discussion and on these issues. And I think that it behooves all of us within the Massey community, and then in Toronto and Canada more broadly, to listen to what you're demanding and asking for in calling for these conversations, and what comes out of them. But I will wrap my little bit there. I have so many more. I'm just so excited to talk to you all. So, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was a really great. I really liked your point about the inability for us to sort of explain to people who might not have the same subjective experiences that we do why these things matter so much to us. And I think this sort of ties very well with. So Sunit and I know that you and I have talked about this at some points, various points. The issue of sort of like epistemic injustice or hermeneutic injustice. So perhaps I'll throw it to Sunit. You could either maybe respond to Lily or to the questions of, our relationship with home, whatever you'd like to respond to.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Stacy. Lily, I found myself having a hard time keeping up with the many things I wanted to ask you while you were speaking to us. I'll say first, I think it's worth saying and meditating on the fact of how personal what you said was, right? And the fact that what we're talking about today is really so deeply personal. And it's hard. Identity, in one way, it's the way that others look at us and what they see when they look at us. But it's so much more crucially how you understand yourself and what it is that you see as resonant with your being. Um, I'll pick up on that phrase you used, personal grief. As you were saying that, I thought about the fact of my parents, probably very similar to many of our parents, who left something that was a home out of necessity or choice, with this idea of trying to have something more for us, right? I think this great American dream or this great Canadian dream, this idea that a life here would offer us a greater chance of whatever, of some achievement. Um, and I think about the fact that for them this meant an absolute rupture in some ways of something that very likely for them felt like home. Um, I always, growing up, balked against the idea that my parents held me to standards that made sense of a Bangladesh that they left in 1973, right? That no longer existed and that was long gone. And thinking about the fact that if they went back to Bangladesh now, they'd probably feel estranged from it. It would not be the home that they left. And for me, growing up, it was always this great challenge of negotiating this identity that resonated for me at home, of a place in a way that no longer existed. It's a place of history that my parents left, and the larger culture that I grew up in. And there was always a schism between the two. And often the two were at ends with each other. And for me, it felt personally as if I was choosing the one versus the other. And not surprisingly, growing up, I typically chose the other. And I wondered sometimes, what has it meant? How has my parents seen my path towards thinking more complexly about where both of these worlds fit into who it is that I am? Um, and how that's made them feel about the fact of leaving something for them that would have simply been home. Lily, you talked about the fact that pursuing graduate studies, in a way, it I don't want to say estranged, but it created a distance between you and your parents. And I wonder what it must have meant for them to feel both at the same time tremendous pride to see their daughter succeed in this way, and at the same time anguish of something that they knew was lost, and probably they knew was lost the moment they left their home.
I think you're onto something there. I think there is just so much grief bound up in that pride and that sense of success. And I think that sometimes when we talk about Asian diasporic identities, there's a bit of a tendency, I think, to emphasize the triumphalist narrative. You know, we did this, we've arrived, we've triumphed over many, many, many obstacles. And one of the things that I I think you and I and maybe others in the room with us can take a moment for, because we have the privilege of doing so, is to take a moment to recognize that there was some loss in those victories. That there was some. I don't think my parents could say out loud, "It makes us very sad that we don't know how to talk to you, that we will never read your writing, we will never read your book." Like, I just don't think that conversation is possible in many ways. It's foreclosed, and that foreclosure is both necessary within I think, our familial or kinship context, but also so important to note in the kinds of rooms where we are now, so that I think other folks in our communities can see and know and mark those losses, even if they can't be spoken of within the space or the immediate family itself, if that makes any sense. And I do think, Sunit, that what you said about home and rupture is so important to this discussion. And there's something very specific about the Asianness of that. It's not just immigration. There is something about the particularity of Asian identities. We're not Black. We're not part of the Black community, which has a very different history in the U.S. and Canada. And it's a history of difference and diversity. There are so many different forms of Asianness, and that kind of dissonance also needs to come into the discussion. But I do think that what you've said is profoundly important, because there's a way in which it's the generation of folks coming after the rupture who can actually recognize the loss of the rupture, or speak to it, and that there's a kind of way of honoring that we can do in that. So I do think that what you've said is so important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lily and Sunit. So I really like this idea of the Asian identity being wrapped up in feelings of guilt or loss in certain ways. I think perhaps all of us being members of the community that have access to higher education, in some ways, this inherently is wrapped up in feelings of guilt that my parents or our parents worked for us to have these opportunities, but there's a guilt in taking up these opportunities that our parents would not have had access to. Things like higher education, things like even being a part of a community like Massey, financial security, these things that our parents worked for that we now have, that in some ways feels like we feel guilty for taking up the very things that our parents worked so hard for us to be able to have. I think there's something about that is inherently wrapped up in Asian immigrant identities. And so I wanted to pick up on this sort of issue of loss, this, I guess, theme of loss and grief, and the spatial temporal sort of gap that Dr. Das picked up on, that our homes are not the same as when we would have left them, or when our parents left them. And this reminded me sort of what Christine said at the beginning, of the sort of temporal nature of our identities. So I wanted to turn to Christine. Christine, do you have any thoughts on anything that Lily or Sunit have said? Or again, this issue of home? We'd love to hear thoughts.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Lily, for bringing grief into the conversation, and in conversation with this question of minor feelings. I've been also thinking a lot about feelings, or as if we had to do like a big data keyword search of just the conversation so far, I would be really interested in quantifying how often community and feeling has like come up, because there's this like sticky affective relationship here between Asian Canadian history and identity as not just something that is like read and like transcribed, but or even somatically felt through the body, but some other somatic register that seems to be escaping our language to formulate right now. And that's why I found what pinged my head when Lily brought up grief, and I'm glad she did, was like its relationship to anger. Because maybe Lily can explain a little more, because I'm deeply interested to hear from everybody on this panel how they are coping and dealing with managing all the anger that there is to actually go around about these issues. Because I remember the Atlanta shootings, there was immense grief for me that I could recognize once I sat with it more. But immediately, and maybe this is just how I am built, as the kids sometimes like to memify, but like I admit it, I sometimes access this grief primarily through anger first. And I never want to say people's anger is invalid. I think anger is productive, anger is good, anger recognizes the harm that is there. But I've talked with other people doing this community work and the difficulty of not letting, your anger be destroy you, destroy your relationships, destroy your ability to be see yourself in relation to others. And I was wondering if Lily wanted to elaborate more on like this distinction between all the like the rightful, I think, incredibly rightful rage at the lethargy of like privileged institutions to do anything to in terms of addressing anti-Asian violence, and how does that coexist with this more new this register of the grief. I'm just speaking as like the digital media scholar on the panel again, Simon Fraser University scholar and computational humanities researcher Wendy Chun in her book Discriminating Data points out how the term like community is used in these social media platforms as an aggregator that's often defined in terms of division and animosity, and she uses the term angry micro identities to describe the way community has been reformatted to think about what does it mean to you that being able to collectivize with other and identify with other Asian Canadians so often begins with the starting point of like managed micro anger, and how do we have space to make our identities and the feelings that circulate around them macro again rather than micro.
That's so perceptive, Christine, and thank you for the question. And as you were talking, I want Sunit to know that I'm going to throw to him right away, soon, very soon after, because I'm going to, when I think about anger in relation to this recent moment, I have a lot of difficulty accessing it for myself. But when I think about my friends who are particularly Asian medical professionals who have been at the intersection of a kind of astonishing anger. They're the subject of anger, subjected to anger, both in terms of anti-Asian violence, but also in terms of the anti-vaccination movement. That I mean, I'll just be very specific. A very good friend of mine is a surgeon who told me that she no longer wears her scrubs, on the way to work because she's targeted too much. And I felt so much grief when she told me that, but also like white hot rage, like just white hot rage. And I didn't know what to do with that rage, but I felt it so deeply. And then and there's something there for me about the ways in which also the past 2.5 years, 2 years have reframed what I think of as the kind of anger that I can express. And I will say, Christine, that you're right to point to it, and you're right to note that in the past I would have actually skated over the anger, or I would have tried to manage it in a way that was much more socially palatable. But I don't feel the need to be so palatable around it anymore, and I feel it most precisely on behalf of others, not so much myself, but on behalf of others. And so I guess Sunit, I don't know if you have anything you want to say to that, but that's for me been a real node of
Yeah.
actual rage.
Lily, I will say I think anger is frankly so critical for us that our response to, I don't know what word to use other than injustice, our response to hate shouldn't be anything but anger. I believe that. And I don't think Me Too would have happened without anger. I don't think Black Lives Matters would have happened without anger. There, the difficulty with thinking about what Asian Canadian or Asian American identity could mean is partly that there is so much richness and diversity in our communities. And finding community more broadly requires sometimes diminishing those differences to find some commonalities of voice. But I think there are some times where it's critical to be able to do so. And I think one of the critical facilitators of that is anger. We're partly here together today because of the horror that we've seen against the Asian American and Asian Canadian communities in the last year. It's critical to be able to find some voice against that. So I think, Lily, anger is a deep part of what allows that to occur.
Thanks, Dr. Das. Christine, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, so many good ideas circulating our waves like right now, and from building on Dr. Doss's point about like anger as a starting point, and particularly I'm glad he brought up Me Too and Black Lives Matter, these like tangible moments of like coordinated organization that mobilized anger and that grief into strategy. And I was wondering what the folks on this panel think about the work actually that must be done by Asian Canadians in Canada, and on what levels, like not just policy work, but in the labor to rebuild like groups and organizations, but the labor of like our minds and our bodies. What does the labor of the work to be done ahead look like to you? And perhaps we can start with Lily again.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, I think there's so many places, and one of them. So first of all, I think about existing community organizations and the incredible work they're doing. So I think about the Chinese Canadian National Council, for example, and the 1907 project that they've been engaging in, where they are working to try to track anti-Asian violence. And so some of the most basic work, empirical work that needs to be done is also subjective. So we need to start counting what happens so that we have some understanding of the scope of the hate that we've been subjected to, both historically and in the contemporary moment. And I find that this reporting is gutting. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Toronto Police, in coordination with the CCNC, released a report on the ways in which anti-Asian violence has increased. It has doubled in the past 2 years, and it's doubled because we're starting to track it. So there's that. There are amazing organizations such as T-Base, based in China, in the Spadina Chinatown, where, for example, there were volunteers who organized incredible work in terms of community vaccination clinics, offering multi-language contexts for settings for folks who lived in the area. And then I think, honing in very specifically on Massey too, I think we should start having I think a regular conversation on being Asian at Massey. And what does that mean? What is the history of it? And what do we want from that? I think that Massey itself has some work to do, and some reflection, and then some action coming out of that. But I think that even the beginnings of that reflection haven't. It's just beginning. I think actually, like the idea of really engaging with the idea of Asian at Massey. I think Christine has started with you and Dong-Woo and Stacy. I think there are really important precursors to that. Previous Dawns of Hall, previous JFs. Like it's not new, but I do think that this is a particular moment, and I think it's something that we have to stay with.
Thank you, Lily. Sunit, I know that you do some DEI work with the university. So I was hoping to get your thoughts on what do you think, I guess Massey on one hand, or even more broadly, powerful institutions like the university or like hospitals or, systemic institutions. Do you have any reflections on how institutions can help to shape whether narratives or actions constructively to push for this sort of greater representation or equity or justice, however we'd like to phrase it, for these different populations?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. I'll speak to something that Lily said, that it's only been recently that we've even begun to track assaults against Asian individuals. These aren't data that we even recorded. And um, in Canada, one of the consequences of our color blindness has been that we don't track data at any level on race or ethnicity. And I think it's critical for us to speak to the fact that color blindness simply points to something normative that is very tangible, and that is not us. And I think we're in a place to be able to be critical in that way. And so I think it's critical that we talk about race. I think it's critical that we talk about ethnicity. I think it's critical that we make people a bit uncomfortable. Again, to see that color blindness is an artificiality, and one that creates exclusivity and needs to go.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Das. I guess we'll sort of, in the interest of time, sort of go to our final thoughts or wrapping up comments. Granted, this is difficult to do in a conversation or a dialogue that has so many moving parts. I think one thing for me that I reflect on often is, or as a result of this dialogue that has been highlighted by this dialogue, is the ways in which Asian identity has, at least for me, been one of those things that blends into the background, or the ways in which the Asian community has sought to blend into the background. And it was only in response to, or as a result of, us being thrust into the spotlight in a negative sense, given the COVID pandemic, that a lot of us have been forced into a reckoning of what being Asian means. And I think it's easy to be resentful of the causality of this reckoning, that it took these acts of racial violence to lead us to this moment. But I think things like this dialogue remind me that there's a silver lining to this sort of thing. And I appreciate the fact that this reckoning has led me to reflect upon my identity, how I'm, and that this will be something that I'll carry forwards. So I'd like to get the rest of your thoughts on this idea, or upon this theme. Should we start with Christine?
Yeah, final thoughts, right? Because there's so many thoughts already had in this hour. Like, I think in terms of like to build on this thread that we are developing of what organizations can do in terms to turn these like feelings and these minor feelings into a major strategy is to recognize how like I operate at Massey College, a place that I see daily, how dangerous we can be with education, right? Like I, yeah, like in terms of what the long term forward. It sounds like I'm being flippant, but like a really smart community member who also here from Massey, who also works in the game unionization place. We were talking about organization in a space where precarity and racism and gendered violence is like culturally normativized. He said like educating people is one of those like core strategies. They can't really like take away from you. Like they can take away your job. They can not renew your contract. They can remove your right to organize. They can might even remove your citizenship. But like, it's very hard to uneducate somebody about an idea, to uneducate them about the way that they've been treated, and to make them unlearn that, hey, you don't deserve this. There's other ways we can organize our society. That and Massey College being coordinated around this mission statement of like where people and ideas intersect. That is like so deadly in the only the cool, amazing ways. And I hope going forward that, right, like that, this isn't exactly the most like uplifting conversation of topics to be had. But if we're looking towards a future and to maybe the considered feelings outside of grief and anger, or rather see the positivity of those things, I truly continuing to mobilize conversations like this and educational like pure corely like educating people, what we're hopefully doing today asynchronously. That is something I think about a lot, about what does an Asian Canadian identity education look like wildest dreams. We live in increasingly unprecedented times. Like, why not move beyond these imaginations of what we're expected to see in terms of defining representation in the register of like visibility and achievement within major institutions? How do we educate ourselves like outside of conventional frameworks? And I'd love to hand it to Lily, there, our core, one of our core educators on this panel.
Thank you, Christine. I mean, yes, education, 100%. And I think, for example, about what a long road the forms of education that you're talking about involve. This past summer, I taught the first Asian Canadian literature seminar at York University. I mean, it's amazing to me it took that long, and it wasn't entirely because people weren't supporting it. There were just so many obstacles to mounting, the seminar. And when I think about that seminar, I also think about other scenes of education that I've been in that have been profoundly moving. And so recently, one of my doctoral students defended, and it was, a landmark dissertation on the first on Korean Canadian literature and diasporic identities. And one of the things that happened in the middle of that defense was we realized all of a sudden that everyone in the room was an Asian woman. So the committee was comprised of Asian women, the external examiner was an Asian woman, the chair of the committee was an Asian woman. And for the senior colleagues in that room, I mean, it brought us to tears, because when we were graduate students, we couldn't have imagined a room like that for ourselves. So part of what I'm pointing to here is not just education and learning and unlearning, the things that we thought were okay, but also what it means to build these spaces within the learning, the spaces of learning that we are. Sorry, that was a bit repetitive, but what I mean is that it made me realize how important it is to have spaces just for us. If I could throw in that plural pronoun for a second and say that maybe there are rooms within higher education, within the educational sector, that we start to carve out where we, however we want to think about that collectivity, start to talk a lot more with each other than we've been able to do. And how do we create those rooms? How do we create educational pipelines so that those rooms are sustainable and have structure? And how do we keep that conversation so that it can radiate out towards the kinds of forms of justice, social justice, and equity that we long for?
Great, thank you, Lily. And I'd like to think of our little virtual room today as one of said rooms. So I guess final thoughts, Sunit.
Yeah, Stacy, thank you. So first, Christine, Stacy, Lily, thank you for spending the last hour together with me. This has really been fantastic, and thanks so much. Maybe if I can, I'll end on a note of celebration, that I've just learned that the first class on Asian Canadian literature was taught at York University, and that the first major thesis on Korean Canadian literature was just defended. And these are things to celebrate. We this is our home now, right? As strange as that might be, and as difficult as that might be to make sense of, but this is our home. There have never been Asian Canadians before our predecessors and us, and this is ours to make.
Thank you all so much for convening here today in this, as Stacy highlighted, this virtual room. I think it wasn't Lily or somebody else that used the phrase before, people in the room with us, and you use that that term here. That there's many. I'm alone as far as I know in this room, but I know I'm not actually alone. Like in here, and in terms of like defining the space, I just want to sit with how privileged I have been to be able to converse with all three of you over this past hour, and how privileged on behalf of Massey College we are to share with you, the audience, that wherever you're streaming this conversation from. Thank you for holding space for us. I'd like to thank our lovely tech coordinator Joe for bringing his like technical magic into making all of these four rooms one great room. And I'd like to thank Principal DeRossier and Massey College for holding space for this conversation, as well as the Asian Junior Fellows, including Dongwoo Kim, for being, again, doing so much invisible labor and emotional labor behind the scenes to manifest this conversation that was once a series of minor vibes into something, I think, the beginning of, truly, hopefully, a great, bright future of amazing conversations to celebrate, to continue Dr. Doss's note that I think there's a lot to worth celebrating here. All right. Thank you all, and audience at home. Thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you further in the future programming for the next Massey College year. And of course, a final, I've just sung your praises for the hour. A final a gracious farewell to Dr. Lily Cho, Dr. Sunit Das, and future Dr. Stacy Chen for holding space for this conversation.